Today on Brief History, we take a look at a largely forgotten but nonetheless important king of England. Known as a simple yet pious man, he would rise to power amidst the backdrop of a civil war, with his predecessor and father being one of the most despised English kings in the history of the monarchy. He would be forced to rule as no other king had to before him, with his kingship being fought over in a back-and-forth battle until the bitter end. Join me as I take a brief look at Henry of Winchester, remembered today as Henry III of England. Henry was born on October 1st, 1207 at Winchester Castle, from where Henry's nickname would draw its origin. He was the son of King John of England and Isabella of Angoulême, his father's second wife. He was the eldest child of 5 legitimate children, which also included his younger brother Richard. He was educated in his early life by the Bishop of Winchester, Peter de Roche, someone who would play a large role in his early life. However, Henry's childhood was different than many of the prior kings of England due to the political atmosphere that existed at the time of his ascension. Henry's father, King John, was despised in his time and is widely regarded as one of the worst kings, if not the worst king, to ever rule England, and by the time Henry was born, his father had lost much of his inheritance on the continent, which had included Normandy, Anjou, and Maine. His father's high taxation, unjust and unpopular laws, and cruel nature had led to the barons of England rising up against him in what was known as the First Barons' War, to the point that by the time his father had died when Henry was 9 years old, even the throne of England was at risk of being taken from Henry's inheritance. The baronage had offered the throne to the then Prince of France, Louis, who would eventually become King Louis VIII of France. Henry's father also, in years prior, had capitulated to the Pope, acknowledging that England was a feudal possession of Rome, and that the King of England held England as a vassal of the Pope. This piece of information is important due to the fact that a new Pope had come to power in 1216, Honorius III, and he had incentive to make sure that Henry remained king. He tasked this responsibility to his papal legate, Cardinal Guala, and in addition to protection in Rome, a well-known and powerful earl was to lead the defense of young Henry. His name was William Marshal, a man who had served 4 of Henry's predecessors, including his father, uncles, and grandfather. Marshal had kept in good favor by relying on his honor and remaining loyal to the crown at any cost, and was widely respected in his time throughout the realm. Marshal and the loyal nobility knew that a coronation was needed quickly, and Cardinal Guala, who had traveled to England, was to conduct the ceremony. On October 28, 1216, 9 days after the death of his father, 9-year-old Henry was coronated as King Henry III of England at Gloucester Abbey. This coronation obviously carries an asterisk next to it, due to the fact that the coronations are usually conducted at Westminster Abbey in London, and are usually conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, head of the English Church. These deviations from customary processes were necessary due to the political atmosphere stated previously, with many of the barons of England in open revolt and attempting to replace John's lineage with Louis and his French lineage. Louis controlled London and Westminster Abbey, and the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, was on the continent and possibly could have supported Louis, thus making the odd coronation a necessity. This coronation, although non-traditional, was important due to the fact that it gave Henry legitimacy and prevented Louis from being crowned. 4 days after his coronation, Henry took the cross, giving him even more protection from the church. The church was very powerful at that time, and attacking a crusader or preventing a crusader from being able to fill his crusader vows carried with it churchly penalties, which could include excommunication or an interdict. Magna Carta, the document created by Henry's father's barons in order to limit his power, was reissued for young Henry. This essentially became Henry's coronation charter, a vow to rule as a good king, something that would cause barons to defect to his cause, and will be a topic discussed in more detail later. This is a very important thing to note, however, as Henry would be the first king whose kingship hinged on the acceptance of this document and would force him to work within the confines of it. William Marshal raised an army and attacked Louis's forces at Lincoln in what would become known as the Second Battle of Lincoln, defeating Louis and altering the course of the war. Louis, still controlling London, additionally lost the Battle of Sandwich, also known as the Battle of Dover, in which his resupply ships were intercepted and his flagship captured by Hubert de Burgh, Henry's chief justiciar. After Louis's fleet was defeated at Dover, sensing that the tide of English patriotism had caused many to defect to Henry's cause, Louis agreed to renounce his claim to the throne of England and was granted safe passage back to France, with the rebel English barons being pardoned by Henry. William Marshal and the loyal barons had successfully assisted Henry in retaining his kingship, and it was intended that Marshal was to hold the role of chief justiciar. But that role had already been appointed to Hubert de Burgh, as previously stated, who had gloriously defended Dover from Louis and who had gained a significant degree of fame from this victory. Due to the hesitance to remove de Burgh from his position, a new position was created for Marshal, Rector Noster et Regni Nostriel, a title that has been shortened over the years and known today as Regent. Henry's early life had started in chaos, and although the loyal men of the realm provided some degree of stability for the young king, we will see that this stability was not to last indefinitely. The initial years of the regency of William Marshal saw difficulty wielding power, as many barons found reason to ignore orders from Marshal due to the lack of historical customs, that being the king's approval. This was overcome by creating for Henry a great seal in which orders could be officially stated as the king's wishes. Unfortunately, William Marshal became ill in February 1219 and died in May, and with that came the next phase of disagreements in regards to the then 11-year-old King Henry. Obviously, the main issue was who would hold control over the king, and there were three main candidates for this position. One was the man William Marshal had wished to control the king, Cardinal Pandulf, a replacement for Cardinal Guala, who conducted Henry's coronation. The second was Henry's custodian and mentor, Peter de Roche, who believed he had the right to the king due to Henry's father's designation that he should be so prior to his death. And the third was the chief justiciar Hubert de Burgh, champion of the Battle of Dover. Although Peter de Roche physically held control of Henry, all three became central figures of power during this phase of the regency. These men were focused on regaining royal rights and started this process by setting up a second coronation for Henry, this time at the correct location, Westminster Abbey, and officiated by the correct official, Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. On May 17th, 1220, at 12 years old, Henry had his second coronation, which was a grand and glamorous occasion. It is important to note that when a king was coronated, or in this case was to come of age, he would have the option to confirm or replace the royal positions of his predecessor. This meant that due to the fact that Henry would eventually be able to dismiss them if he so chose when he came to the age of majority at 21, the leading men looked to gain favor with the young king, but also wished to further their own personal agendas while they had the opportunity to yield power. Henry's mother, Isabella of Angoulême, returned home in 1217 without her son, and some today view this as abandonment of Henry. However, it was not uncommon for royal children to be raised in households away from their parents, and it was probably the case that the leading men in charge of Henry played a role in this separation. However, without someone in his life to put his best interest ahead of all others, and due to the fact that Henry's reign began under the umbrella of Magna Carta, from which there really was no precedent, Henry was at a disadvantage from the start. Eventually, disagreements arose in 1220 and 1221 between the three regents, with Peter de Roche being forced out and going on pilgrimage. Cardinal Pandulf would also resign his position, leaving Hubert de Burgh as the sole keeper of the 14-year-old king. De Burgh was in control, but slowly Henry was allowed more and more kingly duties, taking control of the Great Seal at 16 years old and being taught about the duties that he would someday inherit. De Burgh seems to have done well with the king, with England seemingly uniting behind Henry, but eventually de Burgh's influence over Henry would decline, and Henry would become more and more under the influence of the church and the Archbishop Stephen Langton, with de Burgh remaining as a close justiciar. Although Henry's father had lost a majority of important lands on the continent, the English crown still held control over some loyal lands on the continent. However, the French King Louis VIII was campaigning and taking over much of these territories, with the port of La Rochelle, where Henry's father had launched his unsuccessful reconquest attempt years prior, falling in 1216. There was a territory that the English held on the continent, known as Gascony, part of modern-day southwest France, just north of the Spanish border. It was decided to send Henry's younger brother Richard to Gascony, but a tax was needed to raise money in order to send him. This brought back memories in the minds of the barons of the horrors of King John's taxation, and although this was approved by the barons, Henry was to permanently reissue Magna Carta and its companion document, the Charter of the Forest, in order to secure the tax. Magna Carta was issued by the barons of Henry's father, King John, during John's reign in response to his high taxation and deviant actions as king. It attempted to limit the power of the king and allowed barons to declare war if any clause of the document was broken. The Charter of the Forest was a companion document issued shortly after Magna Carta, re-establishing rights of the forest for free men, although it was done in Henry's reign under the regency of William Marshal. The version of Magna Carta that Henry was to reissue was not the same version that was originally drafted for King John, and there were two very important changes to be noted. Number one, Magna Carta would henceforth be considered law, and law not just for free men and women, as was the case in 1215, but for all men and women, as a great number of the population was not considered free. Number two, taxation by the king required formal approval from a great council of barons. This council would be known as Parlement, a French word, but would remain as a part of English government to current day under its anglicized pronunciation, Parliament. These charters, Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, were reissued by Henry in 1225 and would play a major role in the future of his reign and would also become the basis from which many modern future rights would arise over the centuries. Henry came of age in 1228 but still chose to keep Hubert de Burgh as chief minister until 1232. Peter de Roche returned to the country at that time and saw that Hubert de Burgh had made many enemies in his time away. He used this to his advantage and was able to remove him from his position, just as Hubert had done to him years prior, taking over Hubert's role himself. However, eventually Hubert de Burgh was pardoned by King Henry, and Peter de Roche was deposed from his position, with Henry taking over full control after that. Henry, however, would need to rule differently than any king before him. Many people of the realm were still weary of kingly powers, even after the reissuance of Magna Carta, with Henry's father being responsible for the First Barons' War, and his grandfather being involved in the murder of Thomas Becket. Also, by the time Henry fully came to power, the realm had enjoyed almost 20 years without the imposition of a king, and many had become accustomed to this. Henry was not yet married at this time, and after multiple failed attempts to find a bride, Henry chose a 12-year-old girl named Eleanor of Provence and married her in 1236. Eleanor's sister Margaret had married the King of France, now Louis IX, a year prior. Henry's marriage to Eleanor would secure a connection between him and another very powerful family on the continent through Eleanor's mother, Beatrice. This powerful house was known as the House of Savoy, which controlled an area in the southeast of modern-day France and northwest of modern-day Italy. Eleanor's uncle, William Savoy, was heavily involved in the negotiation of the marriage and traveled to England with her. Quickly, he exerted influence over the impressionable Henry and became the head of Henry's council, with many of Eleanor's family and connected followers, known as Savoyards, being appointed to positions of power or influence within the king's life. This would come to include the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Keeper of Windsor Castle, the mentor of the royal children, and the sister-in-law to Henry, as Henry's brother Richard married Eleanor's sister. With this, much of Henry's reign in the 1240s was greatly influenced by Eleanor and her Savoyard companions. Henry wished to recapture the county of Poitou and the port city of La Rochelle on the continent. His mother, Isabella of Angoulême, had initially been betrothed to a man named Hugh de Lusignan, but Henry's father had married her instead of Hugh, which the then King of France, Philip Augustus, used to his advantage, opening hostilities that would end up leading to the seizure of Henry's father's territories on the continent. Eventually, his mother traveled back to her native land and ended up marrying the son of the man she was initially betrothed to, also named Hugh de Lusignan. Poitou was dominated by the Lusignan family, and the area had not had direct rule from a king of France or England in some time. However, in 1241, King Louis IX attempted to install his brother Alphonse as the Count of Poitou. Henry's stepfather, Hugh de Lusignan, did not wish to see this happen, and so allied himself with his stepson Henry, inviting Henry to take military action. Of course, a campaign of this sort was expensive, and taxation would be needed for such an endeavor. Henry called a parliament in 1242 to request taxation in accordance with Magna Carta, but was unable to convince his barons to approve the tax due to the fact that this campaign was eerily similar to the disastrous and expensive campaign that Henry's father had gone on to reconquer his lost lands on the continent in 1214, which led to the First Barons' War. Henry decided to fund this campaign on his own accord with his own resources and took off on this campaign with his barons accusing him of breaking the terms of Magna Carta. The campaign would end up being a disaster, with his allies in Gascony failing to fully support him due to their own dislike of the Poitevins. His money quickly ran out, and King Louis moved against him, causing barons of Poitou, including his mother and stepfather, to eventually side with Louis. In September of 1243, he returned to England, his reputation forever damaged by this failed attempt. Additionally, Henry was forced to take on a large amount of debt, to which he called Parliament to request reimbursement. This obviously was refused by the barons, and moreover, the barons requested to choose Henry's chancellor and justiciar, as their trust for him was dwindling. This was refused by Henry. Henry then, in what was perhaps an attempt to remove himself from the grasp of his wife's Savoyard allies, began to bring over members of the Lusignan family in 1247, including his half-brothers and sister along with their followers. He vigorously supported them in return for military support, but it was again at a cost to his reputation, for he may have lessened the grip of his wife's Savoyard family, but he was now firmly in the hands of the Lusignans. Henry was said to have been a very pious and kind man, taking great pride in his piety and dedication to the church. He was remembered for this in modern times, but his contemporaries also noted his pious behavior as well, specifically noting Henry's reputation for feeding paupers, aka the poor. Henry was specifically enamored with the Anglo-Saxon king and saint, Edward the Confessor, who was the king of England prior to its conquest by William the Conqueror. Edward had been canonized as a saint in 1161, and some believe that Henry gravitated towards Edward due to his pious nature as well, in contrast to other English kings who gravitated towards warrior saints, such as that as Saint Edmund of East Anglia or Saint George. Edward the Confessor had rebuilt Westminster Abbey, known as St. Peter's Abbey during his time, as a royal burial church, which was completed just prior to his death. Westminster was already an important place in Henry's time, being the place from which the kings of England were coronated. However, Henry believed that it lacked in comparison to his French rival's equivalent, Reims Cathedral. In addition, the French had a royal mausoleum at Saint-Denis, which Henry was envious of as well. He decided that Westminster was to be his family's royal mausoleum, and that it was to be remodeled to compete with the elegance of Reims. He would utilize the Gothic style of architecture seen on the continent, but which had not been used in England to that point, and was set about bringing his goals to fruition over the course of his lifetime. Much of the abbey that is seen in modern day was completed under Henry's time as king, and although it would stand the test of time and become one of the most famous buildings in the world for hundreds of years, it was expensive to complete, and it put a strain on Henry's already depleted financial resources. It should be noted that although Henry was widely seen as a pious man, most certainly a positive aspect in that time, he was simultaneously seen as a simple man, meaning daft, foolish, or for lack of a better term, stupid. Much of this was brought on by his predisposition to be easily influenced, but also by his questionable decision-making, specifically choosing to focus on pointless endeavors while ignoring the crucial affairs that potentially posed a threat to the kingdom. This is something that we will discuss shortly. By 1253, Henry had two sons, Prince Edward, 14 years old, and Prince Edmund, 8 years old. Henry traveled to Gascony to shore up some issues that had persisted since his failed invasion attempt in 1242, mainly the fact that Gascony had been left in the hands of lords that the Gascons disliked. Henry brought with him 14-year-old Prince Edward to install him as replacement. While there, he brokered a marriage for Edward to Eleanor of Castile, as Castile had long laid claim to Gascony themselves, Castile being part of modern-day northern Spain. This marriage pacified any future potential disagreements between England and Castile. After the marriage and successful implantation of Edward, he attempted to do something similar for his second son Edmund in 1254. He wished Edmund to become the king of Sicily and had the backing of the Pope, as the Pope, now Innocent IV, was in a battle for power with the German kings, who had, as of recently, been in control of Sicily. This turned out to be a foolish desire on Henry's part, as an army would have to be raised to defeat the current Sicilian ruler, and an enormous amount of money was requested by the Pope to reimburse him for expenses already incurred. In addition, an annual tribute was to be paid to Rome for the position. Henry, needing to tax for the expedition and foolishly thinking that it would be an easy sell to his barons, found the opposite was true when he called a parliament to request permission. No one, not even his brother Richard, agreed to the endeavor, citing that the negotiations had taken place with the Pope in private and that the barons had not even been consulted on the matter. Also, it was widely believed that he had been persuaded into taking on this campaign by his foreign Savoyard and Lusignan family members, along with the Pope. Major rifts had been starting to grow in regards to Henry's foreign family members, specifically with the Lusignans, which included his half-brothers, although the Savoyards had their fair share of detestation as well. The Lusignans and their followers, who now were in positions of power, were granted special rights and privileges, including being immune to prosecution, which they used to their utmost benefit, arrogantly and ruthlessly subjugating other noblemen without fear of repercussion. Henry refused to hold his Lusignan family members responsible for their actions, and it was this that would spark a major dispute between Henry and his barons, as Henry was acting as an impartial judge against the terms of Magna Carta. One of the men that had been insulted and accused of treachery by the Lusignans was a powerful earl, the Earl of Leicester, a controversial man who had worked his way in and out of Henry's royal favor over the years. His name was Simon de Montfort, and he had been brought up in France, son of Simon de Montfort the Elder, a religious fanatic who battled Henry's father King John on his continental request attempt in 1214 prior to Henry's ascension. Simon had come to England in 1230 to assert his claim to the earldom of Leicester, which he was granted, and was able to work his way into Henry's inner circle, eventually marrying Henry's sister Eleanor. He also assisted Henry in his failed campaign in Gascony, although he had been exiled prior to that and had disputed over Eleanor's dowry before working his way back into the king's favor prior to the campaign. He had been the leader in Gascony that Prince Edward had replaced in 1253, for which the Gascons despised him due to his harsh rule. Although Simon had previously been an ally of Henry, he now staunchly opposed the king and his Lusignan family. Simon, along with a few other powerful barons, including Henry's Savoyard family, who also stood to gain from the defeat of the Lusignans, formally swore an oath of mutual aid to each other and prepared to take on the Lusignans. This coalition of barons, fully armed, marched into the King's Hall at Westminster and demanded that the Lusignans be removed. Henry capitulated to the barons, offering that a council of 24 men should decide the future of the realm, 12 of which he would appoint and 12 of which the barons would appoint. In June 1258, this parliament was held, where a set of constitutional reforms was developed known as the Provisions of Oxford. These provisions stated that a new controlling council of 15 men was to be created to reform the realm. 3 of these men would be with Henry at all times, and additionally, Henry's chief justiciar, chancellor, and treasurer was to be chosen by the council, and the council would govern based on the principles of Magna Carta. They also declared that Parliament would meet 3 times a year, whether the king called them or not. Prince Edward, although initially denying the provisions, finally was persuaded to take the oath and was put under supervision of the barons who were designated to control the young prince. The Lusignans obviously were no longer to be a part of the realm, and they fled to the continent. Henry embarrassingly had had all of his power stripped from him, and he was now a mere pawn of the baronage, but this was far from the end of the disputes between Henry and the powerful men of the realm. By 1259, Simon de Montfort had arisen as the leading baron in the fight against Henry, and was continually rising in prestige and power. It is important to note that France and England were still in open hostility against each other, and a peace agreement was wanted by all, including Henry. Henry desired this due to the fact that he needed peace with Louis IX in order to pursue his desires to have his son Edmund installed as King of Sicily, which, incredibly, throughout all that was transpiring, was still at the forefront of Henry's mind, an indicator to many of Henry's foolishness. A peace treaty was brokered, known as the Treaty of Paris, in which Henry and all his siblings and heirs would renounce their claim to the lands lost by Henry's father King John on the continent, which included Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Poitou. Henry would also recognize Louis as his feudal overlord for his possessions that he still held on the continent, which included Aquitaine and Gascony, and would physically pay homage to Louis for these lands. This would be done in return for significant monetary compensation. Henry traveled to France in November of 1259 at 52 years of age, escorted by the members of the Council of 15, which included Simon de Montfort, to take part in the ceremony and subsequent celebrations that followed peace treaties. Henry, in an attempt to impress the French king and his court, spent lavish amounts of money, something he could ill afford. He stayed in France until April, continuously attempting to show off his wealth, and was eventually forced to take out a loan with the French Templars when his money ran out. Henry's extended stay in France was due in part to his desire to attend his daughter's wedding to the Duke of Brittany, but also in part to avoid conflict at home, as Simon de Montfort had returned to England. The king feared for his own safety and wanted to have a mercenary army to defend him from his enemies in England, which by that point had come to include his eldest son, 20-year-old Prince Edward, who had sworn an oath to Simon de Montfort, perhaps due to his desire to become king sooner than later. Eventually, Louis visited Henry and chastised him for ignoring his duties in England, which seems to have lit a fire underneath Henry, for after this chastisement, he immediately prepared for his return to England. Henry suddenly decided that he had had enough of the Baron's hold on him. He had Kentish bowmen gathered at Dover to protect and escort him upon his return. He defiantly stood up to the Council of 15, his son Edward and Simon de Montfort, clearly stating his intention to rule in his own right, as he did before the provisions of Oxford were issued. Edward immediately submitted to his father, and with Henry's defiant show of power, Simon de Montfort had few allies that stood up with him in this standoff. In July of that year, Henry, now holding the upper hand and gaining momentum, laid charges of disloyalty against Simon de Montfort, with a trial being held at Oxford. Unfortunately for Henry, Simon was to use this to gain back the upper hand. Simon, for all the negative characteristics that had been attributed to him throughout his life, was extremely influential, charismatic, and charming. His eloquent defense of himself at his trial won back many of the nobles who were on the fence or who had defected to Henry's cause. In addition, the Welsh simultaneously reopened hostilities, making Simon's military prowess needed in handling these issues. Henry ended the trial, and Simon went off to defend the West against the Welsh. With Simon back in the driver's seat of power, he chose the new men who were to hold the positions of Chancellor, Treasurer, and Justiciar. Henry's son Edward again switched sides, reverting back to support Simon, and the Council of 15 resumed their duties over Henry. Henry had been on the precipice of gaining back his full power, only to have it snatched away from him at the last moment. However, this roller coaster of events would continue into 1261. In January, Henry again began to conspire to regain complete control. He secretly sent word to the Pope requesting support to overthrow the council which had had control over him. In February, Henry fled to the Tower of London, and from there held February's Parliament, in which he defiantly and openly accused the council of usurping his crown. This dramatic event gained momentum when the Pope, now Alexander IV, voided the provisions of Oxford, demanding that all submit to Henry's royal power. Henry also began bringing his powerful Lusignan family members back to England. In May, he traveled to Dover, dismissing the keeper of the castle, as Dover was a very important coastal installation, as evidenced by the events of the Battle of Dover that took place early in Henry's reign, which caused Louis VIII to flee and cemented Henry's position as King of England. It was at this point that his son, Prince Edward, yet again switched sides and now again supported his father. This was important in that now the barons no longer had any royal legitimacy on their side, something that was desperately needed in feudal England. Opposition began to deteriorate, with Henry appointing his own justiciar, chancellor, and treasurer after declaring that Simon's choices for these positions would no longer be acknowledged. He dismissed all sheriffs who held control of castles, again installing the positions with his own men, giving him strategic advantages, and although the barons attempted to counter-install their own sheriffs, this was to prove unsuccessful. Simon and the barons attempted to call knights to service to stand up to Henry, but the knights failed to show, a sign that Henry's momentum was no longer stoppable, with many leading barons defecting to Henry's side. Henry had an army of mercenaries land in the fall of 1261 in preparation for war. However, in November a treaty was reached, known as the Treaty of Kingston upon Thames. This saw the disbanding of the Council of 15, with Simon de Montfort exiling on the continent, and many of Henry's Lusignan family members restored to power. Henry, in a back-and-forth battle, had finally attained what was taken from him so many years prior, his right to rule as a divinely anointed king. But despite his great victory, Henry was still consumed with the issue of getting his son Edmund installed as the King of Sicily. He wrote to the Pope requesting that this take place, to which the Pope replied that the offer was no longer available. It was clear that Henry, through all that had recently happened, should have been focused on more important matters, but it appears that his aspirations were geared towards that of show and grandeur, rather than that of stability, reconciliation, and proper governance. Simon de Montfort became part of King Louis's court, and Henry decided that it would be a good idea to travel to France to undermine Simon's relations with the French king, to the dismay of his supporters. Henry traveled to France from July to December 1262, with government being left in the hands of some of Henry's advisors. Things began to go wrong for Henry at that point. His advisors were not able to exert proper control, and the Welsh began to rebel, and Henry himself fell ill in France, very nearly dying. It was said that 60 of his courtiers died of the same sickness that he had contracted. Henry decided to travel around France visiting shrines rather than heading back to England to deal with the issues at hand, and in the meantime, Simon de Montfort, ever ambitious, returned to England after corresponding with the then Pope, Urban IV. Simon brought with him to Parliament in October a letter from the Pope that reaffirmed the provisions of Oxford and revoked Henry's absolution from the previous Pope. Simon quickly returned to France, leaving England in a maelstrom of frenzy. Henry still decided to remain in France, however, some say foolishly, finally returning around Christmas of that year. The reassertion of the provisions of Oxford caused the barons to call for Simon de Montfort to return to England, which he did, landing in April 1263, ready to take the fight to Henry yet again and fully reinstate the provisions. His forces began to capture castles in key cities, including London, with more and more barons joining his cause as he gained momentum. By July 1263, he had succeeded in his attempts, and a peace was called, with the provisions of Oxford being reasserted and all foreigners being kicked out of the government again. Although the Lusignans had acted menacingly when in power, the expulsion of foreigners was part of a larger growing movement of English pride that was beginning to manifest. These feelings of pride were not just being felt in the lower rungs of society, whose population had, since the Norman conquest, been exclusively English after being subjugated by the conquering foreign Normans, but now were also being felt within the circles of the upper nobility and clergy that traced their lineage and predecessors to the continent. Simon de Montfort had again amazingly regained control of England, and he began to rule the kingdom on his own accord, rather than by the guidelines put forth by the council. One interesting change that Simon made was in relation to that of sheriffs. Much of the power behind the barons came from the unrest and anger felt throughout the entire kingdom, including the lower echelons of society within the shires. In an attempt to appease these lower-born subjects whose support was needed, Simon took away military powers of sheriffs who had traditionally been seen as oppressors of the people and who the people often complained about. The sheriffs would strictly be in charge of finances of the local areas moving forward, reporting to the exchequer. This would set the foundation for the structure of sheriffdoms we commonly recognize in modern stories such as that of Robin Hood, collecting taxes and bringing financial burden to the people. In September, Simon and Henry met in Bologna for negotiations and agreed to have Louis IX presiding over the meeting as an arbitrator. Both agreed that they would accept the judgment of Louis in their disagreements, and astoundingly, Louis, a king himself, sided with Simon, agreeing that the provisions of Oxford were to be the basis of government, and that there should be limitations on that of Henry, another divinely anointed king. But although the horizon seemed dim for Henry, he would find that the light of fortune would once again shine in his direction. By the time Parliament met in October, shortly after the meeting between Simon, Henry, and Louis, Simon had started losing supporters. Prince Edward and Henry began an armed resistance based at Windsor Castle, and when an offer came from Louis to arbitrate again, both Simon and Henry agreed. Simon and the barons expected a similar result, that Louis would rule in their favor, and that the provisions of Oxford would remain as the basis from which government would defer moving forward. However, what Simon didn't know was that in his most recent rise to power, many of Henry's supporters had fled to the continent. One of which was his Savoyard wife, Queen Eleanor, who we must remember was the sister-in-law of Louis, his wife being Margaret, Eleanor's sister. Eleanor had been using her family connections to influence her brother-in-law against the barons and the provisions of Oxford during her time on the continent. So much so that when Henry, Simon, and Louis met for the second time in Amiens in January 1264, Louis openly condemned the provisions and declared that Henry was to be ruling without limitation. Simon and his supporters refused to accept this arbitration, and in April 1264, the first war moves were made in what would become known as the Second Barons' War. Henry marched an army from Oxford and captured Northampton Castle, with many other castles capitulating to the king along the way. A month later, the barons' forces, led by Simon, engaged the king's forces at Lewes, in what was to become known as the Battle of Lewes. Simon, being the more skilled military leader, defeated the larger royal force, causing Henry and his son Prince Edward to take refuge in the Lewes Priory. Simon laid siege, but eventually a settlement was reached, known as the Mise of Lewes, which basically reaffirmed the provisions of Oxford, but also declared that Henry's son Edward was to be held as a hostage at Wallingford in order that Henry would behave according to the barons' wishes. A new Council of 9 was declared at the next Parliament, acting similarly to the previous Council of 15. Simon ran the kingdom for the next year and a half, with Henry basically being a prisoner, but needed for legitimacy. He remained in Simon's company and was never imprisoned in a castle as other deposed men of power had been in the past or would be in the future. In November 1264, royalists unsuccessfully attempted to free Edward, who was then moved to Kenilworth Castle. Queen Eleanor began to raise an army in France, with Simon doing the same in England in preparation. At the next parliament, it was intended that Henry would swear that Simon and his close supporters could not be prosecuted by the king for their disagreements in the past. Edward was forced to swear a similar oath, and it was intended that these constraints that were placed on Henry would also be inherited by Edward once he became king. However, Simon made a crucial mistake in his management of the realm. He saw to it that his own interest in wealth, as well as the interest and wealth of his own family, grew exponentially, which came to include many of Prince Edward's valuable lands, which were seized by Simon and simply given to himself. This caused some to accuse him of doing many of the same things that Henry did, and it was beginning to look as if Simon was setting up his own heirs to become future leaders of the realm, at a cost to Henry and his own family dynasty. This was at odds with the provisions of Oxford, and caused Simon to lose some major allies, including a man named Gilbert de Clare, who had been one of the most powerful and leading barons alongside Simon. De Clare allied himself with Henry's foreign family members, the Lusignans, who landed in Pembroke with a formidable army. In addition, Edward was able to escape his captivity after wearing out his guards' horses during training exercises, and then jumping onto a fresh horse to escape to freedom. Edward's addition to the rebel forces gave them royal legitimacy, again something that was absolutely necessary in that time, with more and more men beginning to flock to Edward's banner. By this point, Edward was becoming the respected military leader that he would be long remembered as, and he began to lead a campaign that saw the capture of many castles. Simon had traveled to Wales and made an agreement with the prince, Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, that in exchange for military backing, Simon would recognize Llewellyn's title. This further isolated Simon from the nobility, as the Welsh were not popular in England. Simon, now being in the West, had sent word for his son, also called Simon, known as the Younger, to raise a relief army to meet him. However, Simon Sr. was at Hereford, accompanied by Henry, and Prince Edward and his allies captured Gloucester and Worcester on the River Severn, which trapped Simon in the west. With the relief army led by Simon the Younger eventually reaching Kenilworth to the east of Edward's forces, Simon desperately needed to meet up with his son, but was unable to do so due to Edward's blockade. However, Edward faced a choice. He had enemies on both sides of him, and he needed to choose who to deal with first, lest they establish communication and both move on him at the same time. He chose to engage Simon the Younger's forces at Kenilworth and headed east. The departure of Edward's forces gave Simon Sr. the opportunity to evacuate Hereford and cross the River Severn, which he did. Simon continued his march in an attempt to meet up with his son and reached the small town of Evesham on the evening of August 3, 1265. Evesham was located in a loop of the River Avon, with water on three sides. The next morning, August 4th, a dreary and rainy day, Simon received word from his scouts that his son was marching a relief army to him at Evesham and was only a couple hours away, something that was of great relief to Simon. However, what Simon did not realize was that Edward had already defeated his son, Simon the Younger, in Kenilworth, and had used captured Montforian banners to trick Simon's scouts into believing the advancing army was his son's. Simon's smaller force was caught off guard when Edward's banners appeared on the horizon, and Simon's forces had no way to retreat due to being surrounded by the river. Simon, fully aware of his dire situation, was forced to attack Edward's forces in what was to be known as the Battle of Evesham. Although Simon's forces fought bravely, they were betrayed by their Welsh infantry support, who failed to engage in battle after seeing the larger royal army. Simon was surrounded and easily defeated, allegedly being killed by a lance through the neck. Traditionally, nobility were often captured and ransomed, part of the chivalric code that had emerged in England in the 13th century, but due to the bitterness that remained in the minds of the royalists after the Battle of Lewes, many of the surrendering nobility were simply slaughtered, with their bodies, including Simon's, being desecrated and dismembered on the battlefield. Henry was allegedly in the company of Simon as he was killed, and was only spared a similar fate after calling to an attacking knight that he was Henry of Winchester and King of England, finally being recognized and carried to safety. Henry's rival and arch-nemesis had been defeated in a cold and bloody display of brutality, and Henry had been restored to his proper place on the throne. However, this would not be the end of the war, and Henry's unforgiving attitude after the victory at Evesham would further his reputation as a simplistic, short-sighted king. After the execution of nobles at Evesham, Henry followed up with punishments of his own, intending to punish the remaining nobility that had opposed him in years prior. Henry began seizing all of the property owned by Simon and his followers, and the widows of those who had fallen at Evesham had their dowers forfeited due to their husbands' disloyalty. These widowed women and their children were also attacked through the legal system as well. The punitive nature to which Henry pursued the losers added to Henry's tone-deaf reputation, as it caused many to continue to fight on due to the fact that they had nothing to lose by doing so, as they stood to lose everything if they capitulated anyways. It also should be noted that although Simon de Montfort's usurpation and exertion of power was unacceptable to many, a large majority of the realm, both in noble and non-noble status, still supported some form of limitations on the king's power, and wanted to continue to have a say in what happened in the wider operation of the kingdom. Eventually, those who lost their lands were reinstated and pardoned, or had the right to repurchase their lands via the Dictum of Kenilworth, which was issued by Henry after enough opposition arose. In November 1267, Henry issued the Statute of Marlborough, which essentially put into law many prior provisions that had been fought over and adjusted over the years, including those at Oxford, as well as the protection of land rights laid out in the Dictum of Kenilworth. 4 of the 29 chapters of the Statute of Marlborough are still in effect in British government in the modern day, making it the oldest piece of statute law currently in use in Britain. Prince Edward took the cross, agreeing to go on crusade, and Henry requested taxation from Parliament in 1268, with Parliament eventually agreeing to fund the endeavor. Edward departed to the Holy Land in 1270 on what was to be known as the Eighth Crusade, but unfortunately, he was never to see his father again. Henry began to become increasingly ill, and although he seemed to recover for a short time, eventually fell ill again, with his condition quickly deteriorating to the point that it was evident that he would not survive. On the evening of November 16, 1272, at 65 years of age, King Henry III of England died at Westminster after a long and tumultuous reign. He was initially laid to rest in the tomb of his most adored king, Edward the Confessor, close to the saint himself, whose body had been relocated to a much grander tomb. Prince Edward, who would soon become King Edward I of England, also commissioned a more grandiose tomb for his father, and in 1290, 18 years after Henry's death, Henry was placed into his new tomb, still remaining close to the Confessor. This tomb and tomb effigy can still be seen to this day at Westminster Abbey. The reign of Henry III is quite an interesting one to try and understand. In many ways, it was a completely different reign than those of his predecessors, emerging under the umbrella of Magna Carta from the start, something that no prior king had experienced. Future kings would have a precedent from which to gauge their aspirations in relation to Parliament and Magna Carta, but Henry did not have such a luxury. He indeed paid for the sins of his father, and many times it seemed showed much of the same inability to rule that his father became so despised for. Many believe Henry to be a fool, easily influenced, and devoid of any ability to form his own opinions or deep understanding of issues. With many people inserting themselves into direct or indirect control of him, it appears that these opinions of Henry are properly based. But we must also remember that other than William Marshall, at the beginning of Henry's reign, his life was, from the outset, filled with men who perhaps never really had his best interest at mind, and whose chief goal many times was to further their own interests. Perhaps it is not a surprise that Henry grew into the king that he was, being a pawn to be maneuvered by powerful lords. This is, in effect, all that he had known from a young age. To call Henry a good king is perhaps a stretch of the mind, but he was a king for 56 years, one of the longest ruling monarchs in the history of the crown, and has widely been remembered for his piety and kindness, something that cannot be ignored. Despite the fact that it may have been at a cost to Henry's kingship, the many legislative leaps forward during Henry's reign would see to influence future reigns and humanity as a whole, with his version of Magna Carta being the foundation from which many modern rights would arise. Henry may be one of the more brushed aside kings remembered throughout history, but the impact of his reign is still felt to this day, in the grandeur of Westminster, in the laws of the land, and in the stories of his back and forth affair with the leading people of the realm. Although Henry has had his fair share of well-founded criticisms, perhaps we must remember him, at least in part, somewhat positively, for his kindness, for his piety, and for the many benefits that have been yielded to us in the modern day, which trace their origin to his reign.